morning, and thank you for coming out to learn more about Standish and Preece. The talk you'll be hearing today will take you through a bit of a journey that we've had over the past few years with this collection. And you're going to hear some of the nice things about this collection, which are that it encompasses a whole lot more than just sort of one function we do. This is one of those collections that we've been able to spin off a variety of projects from, and Dan and I will tell you about those. But it all begins on a morning in late January 2018. I received a call from a man who said his name was John, and he was the last owner of the Standish and Preece photography studio. He said he was cleaning out his earthquake-damaged house, and he had all these negatives. Was the museum interested in the negatives? Now, he had donated quite a number of negatives already from the studio in the 1990s, and he said that this was the sort of the final batch that he still held on to. So I was sort of put on the spot on the telephone. I was relatively new here. I didn't know the Standish and Preece collection at all, what he had donated. So after a couple of seconds and thinking, and I thought, oh, well, he's already donated what I found out later were something like 39,000 negatives. I thought, well, you know, he's probably not giving anything new. This is probably duplication of what we already have. He said it went up to the time that the studio closed, which was around just after the earthquakes. I thought, oh, well, you know, the museum hasn't really thought much about contemporary collecting. Do we collect up to essentially the present day? And I said to him, oh, no. He said, that's okay. We're at the house now. We're loading up. We've got everything ready to go to the tip. That's fine. We'll just add it. So I hung up the phone, and as soon as I hung up the phone, I knew I had misspoken, so to speak. I had made the wrong decision. So I went and found another curator and discussed with her and said, oh, we've been offered this. You know, I think I made the wrong decision saying no. What do you think? And she said, oh, no, yeah, I think we should have it. I think we should have it. But of course, when I hung up the phone, I hadn't taken the guy's number. But luckily, with modern phone technology, I was able to look at my call log, saw his number, rang him back, and away we went. So what happened is that a couple of days later, the curator who I had consulted, she and I went out to the house, which was out in Shirley, and met with John and had a look at what he had. It was overwhelming, to say the least. So this is just one part of what was on offer. So there were bags and bags and bags of boxes of negatives. And this was his earthquake-damaged house. Shortly after the quakes, he left Christchurch. And the house had essentially been sitting vacant for about 7 years. People had gotten in, windows were broken, the weather had gotten in. The house, being post-quake, was in quite a state, and this collection was in there. But we made the decision, Julia and I, that yes, we'd salvage this and take it back to the museum. It did take us a couple of months to get all of sort of the paperwork done at the museum, to get approval, because this is a huge collection. This is bigger than what we usually take in a single donation, thousands and thousands of negatives. So once we had that all in place, in April, we went back to the house and picked it up. I'd been in contact with John because this house was going to be demolished sort of any moment. And of course, time was of the essence. But yes, I rang him. It was all still there, so we rented a van. I and 2 other staff members went out to the house, loaded up the van with pretty much everything we could sort of get our hands on. Unfortunately, one of what I thought was a little gem from the studio had disappeared since we had been there initially, which was a metal sort of stamp thing that they used to impress the photographs with the studio's name. It was a beautiful thing, but unfortunately somebody had gotten into the house and taken it. Luckily, though, people who had been going into the house unlawfully, you could see that they had opened up a few of these negative boxes and went, oh, this isn't interesting, and pretty much left everything intact. So when it came time to organizing everything, it was not a huge job. So we packed everything up and brought it back to the museum, and we put it in a fumigation room. Because it had been sitting in a damp house that, you know, potentially had insect problems, we put it in fumigation to make sure that it was cleaned of anything that we would not want to introduce into the museum's collections. And this is somewhat standard practice for us. If there's something that we bring in that we think will be at risk, we will fumigate it before it enters sort of into the inner sanctum of the museum. So once it was fumigated and released, I spent about a week organizing all the boxes. So I went through, unpacked all the bags, got everything out, and tried to make some sense of what we had taken on to try and think about how we were now going to deal with this. Luckily, it was pretty well organized. All the negatives were, for the most part, in negative sleeves, which were numbered, and put into these former photographic paper boxes. And then each of these boxes was given a number on the end for storage and for being able to retrieve things again. The studio had a very basic, straightforward, but pretty efficient system for keeping track of negatives. So perhaps, you know, you had your photograph taken by Standish and Preece in 1995, and you wanted, it's 5 years later and you want reprints. You'd go into the studio. They had all the clients organized by year, and then alphabetically. So alphabetically first, sorry, then the year, and then the clients, and these refer to box numbers. So we were given there are 2 registers that go along with this collection, and those were donated to us at the time, although we did have photocopies of them from the first time John had given us a donation. So all those boxes, I put them in numerical order, put them into recall boxes, labeled everything clearly so we knew what was what, and then we had to sit back and think, now what? Organizing was the easy part, you know. But what's the museum going to do to process this massive collection? We knew that assessment would have to go on because I think several of us tried very roughly to estimate how many sort of individual photographs, individual frames there were on these negatives, and it came to the hundreds of thousands. So how are we going to tackle this? Most of it was negatives, but there was also the added sort of complication of the fact that there were some CDs. So Standish and Preece had gone over to digital photography in about 2005. So we weren't just dealing with boxes of negatives, we were also dealing with CDs, and all of these have different ways of dealing with them. Now in all, there were 38 of these recall boxes, and within them were about 393 of these smaller boxes, and of course each of those boxes holds lots of negatives. So we had to decide what we were going to keep and what we weren't, and that became another project, and Dan will be telling you about that after I've finished speaking. We realized that this collection and the project that came out of it had enormous potential and opportunity for us to connect with the community. So I had this idea of, well, how about on top of all the other things we're doing with this collection, we put on an exhibition to talk about the studio, the history of the studio, and what we've been able to do with the collections and connecting our community with this. Standish and Preece is New Zealand's longest operating photography studio. They started in 1885, and even though, for all intents and purposes, John finished trading as a photographer and taking photographs commercially in large scale just after the quakes, it wasn't until last year that sort of the company went off of the books. It was no longer a registered company. When I volunteered for this talk, or proposed this talk, I should say, the exhibition was meant to have already been open. It was supposed to have opened last week, but unfortunately, due to some scheduling things and other priorities, it had to be pushed by a week. But it opens on Friday. It's scheduled to run for about 6 months, so there's plenty of time to come back and see it. But what I'll be doing is giving you a sneak peek as to what's going on in there and what you'll be able to see. So the exhibition's held in the second floor temporary gallery, which is pretty much on the opposite side of this floor. If you came in to see the House of Treasures exhibition, it's the same space. If you've seen House of Treasures, you might also notice that the layout is pretty much the same. This was a couple of reasons. One is that it was such a good layout to work with. It was really well designed for House of Treasures, and we could see how the layout was really going to work for what this exhibition was proposed to be. And also, it's a good use of museum resources where we can reuse and recycle and do things like that. So here's the basic layout. The main sort of entrance that we would like people to enter from, but of course that's not always the case though, is off of the Ivan Major gallery. And what you do is you come into section 1, which is a basic overview and history of the studio from its beginning in 1885. After that, you move into photography as a business. I realized that for younger people, what they know as photography is very different from what we knew as photography. And of course, digital has changed everything so much. So I thought it would be good to sort of remind people or educate younger people as to what photography used to be like. Then moving into a very visual area that looks at the output of the studio over these 100+ years. So we move from what is actually a very text-rich beginning, and we end with something that's very colorful and visual. So we're highlighting the studio's work, and then the final section is about this project we had with cataloging and digitizing, which Dan will go into. So the history of the studio. Our story begins in 1885 when Alfred Ernest Lyttelton Preece, known as AE, and Frank Barry Standish, known as Barry, formed a partnership to go into, to create a photography studio. They were young men. AE was just 25 and Barry was 22. AE was born in 1863 in Lyttelton, hence the very colorful middle name of Lyttelton. But when he was a child, the family moved into Christchurch. His father was an auctioneer and a trader. And AE actually attended Christ College from 1877 to 79. Now, Barry was born in 1860 in Chelsea, London, and he came out to New Zealand in about 1880 and settled in Ashburton. And I lose track of him between the time that I know he's in Ashburton and when he forms this partnership with A.E. in Christchurch. So he's a bit of a mystery man. How the two knew each other or got together to form a photography studio when neither of them has a background in photography is an unknown. I just haven't been able to figure that one out. But I have a hypothesis. It's possible that they met through cycling, of all things. A.E. was a keen cyclist. He even opened his own cycling shop before the photography studio, so in his very early 20s. I suspect his father gave him a lot of backing on that. And he was a member of the Pioneer Bicycling Club in Christchurch, and he became a member soon after the cycling club was formed. This is a photograph of him when he was 18, very proudly wearing his cycling uniform. No, this is not a Standish and Preece photograph, but it's another Christchurch photography studio that A.E. often had his photographs taken at, and I suspect might have been somebody who helped show him the rope, so to speak. The earliest mention of Standish and Preece as a studio taking photographs is an article in a newspaper from 1885 that says that the studio had taken a photograph of 3 bicycle club members posed on the lawn of the New Brighton Hotel. So, my suspicion is that they met through cycling somehow, that they were both cyclists and shared that passion. And indeed, this is from a Standish and Preece album. In 1887, the two men and several of their friends took sort of a boys' trip to the West Coast, and it was photographed along the way. And the photographs were later advertised and sold. Cycling was very much a part of their West Coast adventure, and there are several photographs in this album that feature men posed with bicycles. Now in the exhibition, you'll be able to see the album in its entirety because we've had it digitized, and it will be on a slideshow, or just a rotating slideshow. So you'll be able to see everything that they took in that trip. So we know that A.E.'s interest in cycling led to his becoming a photographer. And we know this from a newspaper article from 1884. So this was the year before the studio formed. A.E. went on a cycling tour of England, and the Christchurch Star reported about his travels. So I'll read this out to you. A slight knowledge of photography is now quite part of an English cyclist's education. In touring through the picturesque old country lanes, he has many excellent opportunities of pursuing this fascinating art, especially since the introduction of the dry plate process. Cameras are now specially made for tourists, which only weigh a few pounds and can be carried without difficulty on either bicycle or tricycle. While cycling through the old country, Mr. A.E. Preece of the Pioneer Club, Christchurch, procured one of the dry plate Instagraph cameras and took many interesting views during his tour, by means of which he is enabled to give his fellow wheelmen some idea of the beautiful rural scenery he passed through. So because of all these connections with cycling I was finding in the early years of the studio, the exhibition will have a small cycling section. This is one of the penny farthings from the collection. This is not it in situ in the exhibition because it hasn't been installed yet. This is when it was in the old transport gallery in the museum. So we'll have a penny farthing, and then this is one of those Instagraph cameras. It's quite big, you know, we're not talking little handheld cameras. So if you can imagine being on a cycling trip with this rather large camera you're toting around. It mentioned dry plates, so you had to carry glass plates with you that were then put in the camera to take the photograph. So while It's technology that was, far smaller than the previous cameras. It's certainly nothing like we know now. So in 1885, Standish and Preece set up their first studio on Montreal Street. So it's near the intersection with Beeley Avenue. So it's right up here at the top of town. The property was owned by A.E.'s father. We know that from property records. And from a newspaper advertisement, we know that the studio was described as a corrugated iron workshop, formerly used as a photography studio, measuring 16 feet by 24 feet, which is roughly 5 by 7 meters. So it's quite small little tin shed. I suspect this was where they processed the photographs, and the actual taking of photographs would have been inside of a house on the property, so a more sort of genteel surroundings to meet customers and have their photographs taken. In 1885, the studio moved to High Street, down here. So that's where they were, and they've moved down to this part of town, so not far from Cathedral Square. And the studio was there for over 100 years until they moved to Durham Street in the 90s. This had real advantages over where they were in Montreal Street. So this area of town, as you can see, was not very well developed, sparse buildings, not a lot of foot traffic if you're a business or a photography studio. So moving into town, into High Street, this was really the commercial area of Christchurch at the time, it made a lot of sense for them as businessmen to come into town. So here's the photograph of that building on High Street. It was only about a year old when they moved into it. The earlier building had been destroyed by a fire. I'd like you to note these strategically placed bicycles, because bicycles are very much a part of their interest. Photos here. So that was a common thing for photography studios to put examples of their work out at street level. But the studio itself would have been located up on the upper floor, probably towards the back of the building. And I'll tell you a bit more about why in a moment. So none of you should remember this building at all, because in 1927, the building was remade, brought up to the newest fashion, sort of an Art Deco style, and a third floor put on it. Some of you might remember it looking like this. So this is probably from the 50s or 60s. And you can see they're very prominent with their signage. Just inside the door there are examples of photographs again, trying to draw people in because, of course, they wouldn't have a shop frontage being on the upper floor. And some of you might remember it looking like this. So yes, the building was destroyed in the quakes, and this sort of greenish colored building, that's the building that Standish and Preece had been in. In 2009, museum staff were alerted to the fact that Standish and Preece's doors were for sale at a local demolition yard. So staff arranged to purchase them and make them part of the collection. It's nice that this happened before the quakes, because had it happened in 2011, as we all know, they very well might have been destroyed. I do believe these are the original 19th century doors. However, this, of course, would have been more modern, sort of zhuzhing up. So getting back to our story. In 1890, after only 5 years, A.E. and Barry dissolved their partnership. I think it's very interesting that the longest running photography studio had such a short partnership to begin with. Barry moved to California He became an artist there. I know from research that his grandfather was a somewhat prominent painter in England of animals and racehorses. So when Barry went to California, he went into artwork and graphics and newspapers and things like that, and he died there in Berkeley in 1944. So AE carried on the business, calling it Standish and Preece still, for another 55 years. He retired in 1945 and turned the studio over to Frank Pierce, who had been somebody who had been working in the studio for several years. And then shortly after retiring in 1945, in 1946, AE died at his home in Heathcote Valley. So over 135 years, there were a surprisingly small number of owners. So you began with the Standish and Preece partnership, and then AE Preece takes over for a very long run. Frank Pierce for a few years, a partnership of Rex Stace and Trevor Fleming. Then a man named Nigel Todd, who is currently living in Australia. And finally, John Hunter. So along the bottom there, we have, that's Frank Pierce, Nigel Todd, Rex Stace, and finally, John. I was unable to track down a photograph of Trevor Fleming, so he's really only the only missing link portrait-wise. Right, so where are we? In the 1980s, the studio moved to 213 Durham Street, which again no longer exists. Then on to 262 Choom Street, and then it was given a makeover to make it less 80s colorful. And then this is the building now. So after the quakes, John rebuilt on the site and created something in sort of an older style. So you can see it's still the same addresses here, but he's made a completely new building. And the idea was that he'd have the studio upstairs, and then down on the bottom he'd have a cafe going, and that it would be, you know, sort of a thriving new studio. Unfortunately, because of the quakes, at this time that he did this in 2014, there wasn't a whole lot of foot traffic in the city, again, one of these problems. And he decided that it was time to get out of the photography business. So anyway, that building still stands, and it is a beautiful building. But yeah, unfortunately at the time that he opened this, that end of Choom Street was just nothing much going on there. All right, so section 2 of the exhibition looks at the business of photography. And the main display we have here is a reproduction of a 20th century studio. Unfortunately, there are no known photographs of the Standish and Preece studio's interior like this. This is Clifford, who was their biggest sort of rival, but H.H. Clifford had also trained in their studio, had worked for Standish and Preece before he went off on his own. So as you can see, there's a variety of chairs you could choose for your photograph. There's props, rugs. Here are your backdrops. But what I want you to notice is this and this. So we're talking about photography before you had good photographic lamps, before you had flash photography. But for photography, as we know, you need good light. And all you had really then was natural light. So studios were filled with skylights, with windows, with curtains so that you could try and control the light. And this is why I said their studio, Standish and Preece's studio in that building would have been on the top floor towards the back, which would have allowed them to have a skylight, but also it would have been north-facing windows to allow more light in. So we recreated this in the exhibition. We have a mock skylight and the window here with the curtain, so you have that experience of how it would have been when you visited the photographer. And here it is kitted up. This camera is Standish and Preece's camera from the 1920s. We were given this by one of the former owners. And then the other items are not Standish and Preece, but they are actual objects from the time, and they're from our collections. So moving on. The studio had lots of props. So I showed you furniture, I showed you rugs, vases. But for children, they had heaps and heaps of toys. So here is a very cute little girl from 1955, posed with a lion and a rabbit. And we have the rabbit. So when I was developing this exhibition, I knew we had the rabbit in the collection. And as the collection was being processed, I had talked to our technicians and said, can you keep an eye out for this rabbit? And sure enough, they delivered, and a photograph with the rabbit was found. And so that's in the exhibition. Another photograph where we actually have the object is this little hat. This boy is Alan Ward Smith of Lincoln, taken on his 3rd birthday in 1903. And in 1976, his sister Ethel donated the photograph and the hat to the collection. Another section of the exhibition looks at some of the famous people that Standish and Preece photographed over the years. So you might recognize some people: Stephen Fleming, Bill Clinton, the Wizard, Cliff Richard. And because there were so many sort of photographs, and it was easy to let this exhibition sort of be sort of flat, with lots of labels and reproduction photographs, our exhibitions team really put a lot of effort into making this a dynamic exhibition. So this is a wall with a series of photographs. They rotate, they change, the images, the wallpapers imitate the time period that's being shown. For each time period that's being focused on, there's music or sound that accompanies it. So it gives you sort of a feeling of being maybe in somebody's house looking at photographs rather than in a museum gallery staring at the wall. And I keep talking about John Hunter, the former owner. He's made a series of comments on our website about photographs he took. And they're rather interesting comments. And it's nice to hear a photographer talking about their work. So this section here, which is supposed to replicate, well, it does replicate sort of John's dark room, has the photographs that he took and the comments he made on our website. So again, a dynamic way of showing content that could be, a little static and boring. So as I said, the second half of the exhibition really focuses on visual things rather than text and history. And it really also looks at this really rich collection of photographs that we did receive from John. And here I will turn over to Dan to talk about the work that the museum has been doing with this collection.
Good morning, everybody. So, as Jill indicated, I'm going to talk to you about the process that we went through in a little bit more about accepting these photographs and their related objects and how we actually dealt with them, which Jill touched on a little bit in the beginning. And just to follow up something else that Jill said, Jill talked a lot about the community engagement aspect that this collection presented us with and particularly focused on the exhibition. But that has really flowed through all of the work that we've done on this collection and this project. It's not just the exhibition that's been about public engagement. Pretty much everything we've done on this has been about community engagement. And the reason for that, I suppose there are two reasons. The first is that that's what we do. It's our bread and butter, engaging with our community and making our collections available for people. But in this particular case, it's even more important because it's actually the community that appears in these photographs. So we have got endless numbers of photographs in the collection now, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of faces in these photographs of Cantabrians. So it just made perfect sense for this to be about making the photographs available for people to see. It would be to nobody's benefit if they just stayed in a vault in the museum and nobody ever got to see them. But even more than that, these aren't just photographs of members of our community. In many cases, these are photographs of our community's most precious memories. So we have countless numbers of wedding photographs in the collection. We have countless numbers of graduations. Some of you might recognise this photograph. We've used it on the website and in some of the marketing material. Countless photographs of people with their children, including this, particularly touching one of a young father with his child. So being able to reconnect people with those memories that in some cases may have been lost has been really very important to us throughout this project. And I just wanted to share one particular example with you because it's quite close to all of us that work here at the museum. As we were processing the collection, we came across the wedding photographs of the parents of one of our co-workers here at the museum from the 1970s. And it turned out that they themselves did not have any copies of the photos. They had lost them during the earthquakes. And so they had no images of their wedding day from I think, 1974. When we came across them, we obviously alerted our colleague to that fact. And it also turned out that her father had sadly passed away the year before. So being able to provide copies of their wedding photographs back to our co-worker's mother, less than a year after she'd lost her husband, was really a very special moment. And so that's just one example of how we've been able to reconnect people with these photographs and with the memories that they hold for people. But we've been able to do this much more broadly than just with individuals that we know. And we've been able to do that by putting them online. So this isn't really a new thing. Museums have been putting their collections online for quite a while now. But in this kind of bulk, to put so many photographs up in one go is relatively unheard of in New Zealand. There's only been one or two previous projects. There are now over 74,000 Standish and Preece photographs on our website for you all to go and have a look through. And like I said, the vast majority of them show members of the community. So you get on there and you have a look, and there are probably people in those photographs that you recognise. We also, Jill touched on this with John Hunter in particular, but everybody is invited to comment on those photographs as well. So if you do go on there and you see somebody that you know, don't just have to think to yourself, oh, there's so-and-so. You can actually tell us who those people are, because not all of the photographs are named. And so that's a really important part of the project for us too, to get the community providing this additional information for us. That's much easier said than done, though, in most cases. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the actual processes that we went through to make all of this possible, to facilitate this. It's complicated, first of all, on a practical level. The photographs came to us as, generally speaking, very small photographic transparencies, predominantly negatives. And so before we have processed them, they tend to look like this. Which, unless you have experience in photography, will be quite an odd thing to look at, that kind of reversed image. And they're all on little plastic film sheets. So the first thing we have to do is to digitize them. We have to literally take a photograph of the photograph to then be able to get it up on the website. But because these are for community engagement, because they are for people to interact with, they have to be of a certain quality. We have to make sure that the photograph is high enough resolution that people can actually see the details of the photograph. And also we have to make sure that they are consistent in terms of color balance, light levels, contrast, and all the other things that if you've done any playing with Photoshop, you'll know what I'm talking about. So we had to set those standards at the beginning to make sure that our team of digitisers, a couple of whom are here today, were able to do that work effectively. We took those standards from previous projects that have happened elsewhere. So I mentioned there have been one or two in New Zealand previously. Pukeariki in New Plymouth in particular did a particularly large photographic digitisation project, and we were able to talk to them and to experts at the National Library as well, who were able to give us a little bit of input about the kind of standards we should be living up to. And the result of that is what you see here. So this is the image after it's been processed, and you can see it's much more familiar. It's the kind of thing we're used to looking at now, this black and white photograph. The earlier photographs in the collection are black and white, as you might expect, but it becomes a little more complicated with the more recent ones because they're colour, again, as you might expect. And so the colour negatives maybe look even more alien to people that aren't familiar with photography than the black and white negatives look like. But again, we set ourselves some standards to follow in terms of digitising these and making them available, and this is kind of the end product that you see here. So we take this original negative, we take a photograph of that photograph with a digital camera, it comes up on the computer screen, it's then manipulated by our digitisation technicians, and that's the end product that ends up on the website. There are other practicalities that made this a really complicated process though. It's not just that standard of digitisation. We also had to repackage every single one of these negatives. So nearly 75,000 photographic negatives have to be repacked. And that's because we know that in the original sleeves that they came to us from Standish and Preece they wouldn't survive. They're not archival quality photographic sleeves. They deteriorate over time. And you might have noticed in the photograph that Jill put up at the beginning, they were already quite yellowed in many cases. So we had to remove them from those packages and put them into specialist museum archival packages. We also had to relabel them. So Standish and Preece had their own cataloguing system, but that didn't conform with our more advanced museum cataloguing system, so we had to assign all of them their own number and label them accordingly, transfer all the data over as well. So a lot of the negative packs had the surname of the person that ordered the photographs, or they might have had the name of the event if it was an event that they'd been photographing. All of that had to be transferred over as well. And they all had to be catalogued up to our current data standards to go into our website, into our database. That's the first step before they go onto the website. So we had to decide exactly what pieces of data we wanted to capture. So the names, obviously, of the people in the photographs where they're known, the date that the photograph was taken, for example, if we knew the location at which it was taken. A lot of them were taken in the studio, but particularly as the business developed and into more recent times, they went out on location a lot more. We also might have wanted to capture things like the type of film that the photograph had been taken on. Or the name of the photographer, if it was known. In many cases, we had the initials of the photographer on the pack, and we were able to infer from that who it was that had actually taken the photographs. So again, in advance of actually doing the work, we had to set these standards so that we knew what we were doing as we went through. And in developing the project and putting it together, I came up with this exceptionally complicated flowchart to basically give our team who were working on the project a step-by-step process in what we were actually doing. And there were numerous people involved in this as well. It wasn't just one person doing all of the work. It was additionally complicated in that at the beginning we had 2 digitisation technicians actually taking the photographs, a cataloguing technician who was recording all the data and doing the repackaging. We then had myself doing the project management and doing a lot of the, shall we say, quality control. We had a team of at one point 4 curators actually choosing which images we wanted and which images we didn't want. And then all of that work had to be verified at the end as well. So we have a couple of steps in our process here at the museum. We digitise, we catalogue, but then there's a final step which is to verify that data to make sure that the people doing the work in the early stages have kind of done it properly and that it meets all of the standards that we've set, kind of the quality control that I referred to. So it's a very complicated process. It's further complicated in this case by the fact that it was externally funded. So the money for this project came from the Heritage, from the Lottery Board, their Heritage and Environment, one of their grants from there. And that meant that we had to report back to them how the project was progressing. So not only did we have to follow our own standards, but we also had to meet their expectations too, which added to the complications. It was also very complicated intellectually to decide which images we wanted to keep and which ones we didn't want to keep. So this gives you an idea of the scale to an extent. So each one of those boxes, the small black boxes, contains approximately 1,000 negatives. We estimated that there were somewhere in the region of 380,000 negatives donated by John. And we could not possibly keep all of them and catalogue all of them and digitise all of them. We just don't have the resources for that, even with the external funding. So how do we choose which ones we want to keep and which ones we are going to let go? Well, the first thing we had to do was to set ourselves a practical limit. We know roughly the resources that we're working within. We know how much money we've got from the external funding and how long that's going to last. And we did some testing to figure out how long the process took to digitise, catalogue, repack and verify a single photograph. We could then extrapolate that out and figure out roughly how much time we had available and how many we were able to do. And we settled on 39,000. Now that was quite neat because it was roughly in line with the original donation from back in the 90s as well. So we'd effectively taken on 2 Standish and Preece collections of roughly the same number. But working within that number, we had to come up with ways of deciding and choosing between one photograph and another photograph. Our consideration in that respect was to make sure that our selections were representative, both representative of the community that were in the photographs and that were going to be viewing the photographs online. And as you can imagine, a photographic studio that existed for such a long time will have seen many changes in demographics in Christchurch, so that community will have changed over time as well. But also is representative of Standish and Preece's output. And again, in the early days, they were predominantly taking studio photographs, studio portraits, but by the time the business came to its end just before the earthquakes, they were out on location much more, doing a huge variety of event photography and even a little bit of landscape photography towards the end. So making sure that that output flowed through the choices that we were making as well was really important. We didn't want to take just studio photography because that wouldn't be true to what Standish and Preece had actually done through the course of their history. So how do you choose one photograph out of another? Let's say somebody went to have their portraits taken at the studio and they had 20 photographs taken and they took them home and Standish and Preece kept the original negatives and we've now got those. How do we choose one from those 20? We don't need all of them because we just need to show the one face. How do we choose just one of their portraits out of 20? Well, actually, with the studio portraits, it's quite straightforward. They're all showing the same thing. They're just showing the person that's having their portrait taken. So in that case, we just choose the best quality photograph in terms of its sharpness and its color balance and in terms of how the person probably wanted themselves represented. So, you know, we don't choose the one where they're looking a bit dour, maybe where they've been snapped with their eyes closed. We choose the one where they've got a nice smile, where they're looking happy, probably the one that they would have liked to choose themselves. But it becomes much more complicated further down the line when we have event photography taking place. And I said before that there are literally thousands of weddings in the collection. And how do we choose one photograph that represents this entire event? So these are just 9 photographs that came in from this particular wedding. I picked 9 because that's how many I could fit on the screen at a resolution that you could still see. There were probably more like 50 in this group. So how do we choose one photograph out of 50 to represent the wedding? And that's why it's really complicated intellectually. We have to make those curatorial decisions and to try and capture, I suppose, the essence of the event is what we ended up calling it. What's the most important part of a wedding? Is it the fact that it's 2 people joining in love and so you take the photograph of the couple? Is it a family event that's got lots of people attending to celebrate the important day of their loved ones? Is it the legal aspect? Is it them signing the register to show that they're married? You know, we've got all these questions that we kind of have to answer and it becomes very complicated. And what about cases where we have an event, as we might have originally classed it? So I don't know if you'll recognise any of these people, but these are actually our colleagues at Christchurch Art Gallery having their staff ID photos taken by Standish and Preece. So by our original definition, we would have classed that as a single event. And by our original standards, we would have been locked into choosing one photograph to represent this event. But of course, in this case, that one event is taking portraits of lots and lots of people. So just choosing one would not have at all been representative of the community in this case, because it always comes back not just to Standish and Preece's output, but the community aspect of this as well. So in the beginning, it was straightforward with the studio portraits, but as things developed, we had to change the way that we were doing things to make sure that we were still being representative. And again, we ended up having to develop a fairly complicated process for choosing the different types. We were able to categorize the photos into these 8 different groups. So we've got individual portraits, portraits of multiple individuals, so like the one that I just showed you from Christchurch Art Gallery, group portraits, portraits of multiple groups. So for example, if you have a sports team that are having their photograph taken, you might have a photograph of the whole sports team sitting out on the benches, but then you might also have a photograph of just the coaches, or you might have a photograph of just the manager and the captain, or if it's a rugby team, you might just have a photograph of the backs or something like that. So photographs of multiple groups. Then we had cases of mixed individual and group portraits. So the studio did a lot of school photography as well, where they would have taken a photograph of the entire school class, but then also taken individual portraits of every member of that class. How do we choose from amongst those? Mixed portraits and events. So that's like weddings, where you've got an event going on. There's lots of informal photography happening, but there are also formal portraits taken of the bride and groom and their family, sometimes in the studio, sometimes on location. Then events, and these included a whole range of things. So we had those weddings, we had openings of new buildings, we had sports events, we had some sports events that had no photographs of people in them. So for example, there were a lot of photographs taken at the races, which were just photographs of horses. Did we then have to take a photograph of every single horse that was included in that collection or not? That was additional complication. Parties, that became something of a complication for us as well, because often in the party photographs, people are doing things that they might not want to be associated with. So did we choose those photographs because it would be amusing to choose those photographs, or did we, have to respect the privacy of the people in the photographs and not choose those photographs? That was an additional complication. We then had kind of artistic photographs, shall we say, where there was a lot of artistic Valentine's Day photographs, which were questionable. And like I said, there was some landscape photography later on as well. And although that wasn't representative of their output over a long period of time, did we have to take some of them to represent what they did further down? Probably we should have. And then also one thing that they did later on was quite a lot of business product photographs. So for businesses that were wanting to advertise their products, Standish and Preece would come in and they would take nice photos of the products. So again, there's no people in these photographs, but it is representative of Standish and Preece's output. And that meant that we had to collect some of them at least to be representative. Like I said, there were 4 of us at its peak going through all of the photographs and making these decisions. And that was important as well to have 4 of us doing it, because it meant that we didn't just have one person's choices or one person's biases coming through. We got to spread that load out a little bit and have a bit of variety in the choices that people made. And I think we found actually as we went along that individuals were tending to choose particular types of image that maybe they were drawn to in some way. So it was good to have that mix. In the end, those 4 of us looked at every single one of the 380,000 photographs and chose just under 39,000 of them. And here are our numbers. So 4 curators, 3 technicians over 25 months. But the really great thing was that we completed it 11 months ahead of what we'd scheduled. And that also meant that we were able to return some of the money back to the Heritage Lottery Fund to redistribute to other worthy causes. 37,323 images and related ephemera. So we also had to collect some additional objects, again, to be representative of Standish and Preece and their output. So we collected some of the negative sleeves to show the materials that they were using. We collected some of the prints that they made from the negatives to be representative of their output. Jill already mentioned some of the props and things that came through from the studio. With a lot of the wedding photography, we had little offcuts of the wedding dress material for colour matching. So we collected some of those as well. Some of Standish and Preece's advertising material, there's a big magnetic sign with their branding on the front. We collected that too. Not just picked, but like I said before, digitised, catalogued, repackaged and made available online. We added that to the 36,846 objects already in the collection, And we digitised those too. So they had already been catalogued in the 90s, but they hadn't been digitised previously. So not only were we cataloguing the 37,000, but we were digitising actually almost double that. And what that means in the end is that there are 74,169 objects available for the public to view on the museum's website. And this is the link that you can go to. If you go to that link, you will find that there's a big box on the front screen that says Standish and Preece, and it's got one of the photographs as kind of the front cover. If you click on that, you'll be taken through to the 74,000 photos. And you can either browse through them, so you can literally just scroll down the page and look at every single one of them, or you can use the search box to try and find names or events that you know are included in the collection. And like I said earlier, you can leave comments on the bottom of those too. So if you see a photograph and it's not named, but you know the people in the photograph, then please do leave a comment at the bottom telling us who those people are, and that information gets added to our database as well, so it doesn't get just left and forgotten and lost. It goes into our information, and it will be there for researchers in the future. Thank you very much.